They did not speak. But the entire court felt the strike of that silent gaze. The wife held her ground. The mistress refused to bend. And something cold moved through the hall, as if the walls themselves understood what had begun. No record was kept of their words because none were needed. Memory clung to the stillness more tightly than truth. And behind that stillness waited a story the court never dared to name. Tonight, you will step into the silence they left behind. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand in the great hall of a Tudor palace on an ordinary morning, it would be easy to believe that every movement, every glance, every quiet breath belonged to a world perfectly arranged. Yet beneath the towering beams and the polished floors, there was always a thin current of tension, waiting for the moment when two women, bound by the same man but not the same fate, would finally be forced to occupy a single line of sight. The hall carried the sound of footsteps, silk, whispered greetings. But beneath all of that lived an expectation. The meeting had been delayed long enough. The wife entered first, as protocol demanded. Her pace was measured, her chin steady, her gown heavy with symbols of legitimacy. Nothing about her presence sought attention, yet everything about it commanded space. Servants parted for her without hesitation. Accustomed to the way the air shifted when she walked through a room, she did not seek confrontation. She simply carried the weight of her position. And that alone was enough to fill the hall. The mistress appeared moments later. Not by accident, but by arrangement. Even she understood that her arrival in this place was not her choice. The king had grown tired of managing their distance. The court had grown restless with speculation. And so she entered the hall quietly, though the quiet did little to disguise the unease in her body. Her gown was lighter, her age younger, her status fragile enough to tremble at the edges. Yet she did not hide. Hiding, after all, would be read as weakness. Those who witnessed the moment would later describe it as brief, almost accidental. But nothing in that hall was accidental. The wife turned her head with the slow, deliberate calm of someone accustomed to measuring every gesture. The mistress lifted her gaze because not lifting it would mean surrender. Their eyes met in the middle of the room where sunlight struck the stone floor. A narrow patch of brightness that revealed everything and protected nothing. It was not anger that passed between them. It was not sorrow, not pleading, not fear. It was recognition. Two lives drawn into an arrangement neither had chosen but both would suffer for. The wife's expression remained still, giving away nothing, as if she had spent years learning to let silence do her speaking. The mistress, despite the tension in her shoulders, held her ground without stepping back. She had been instructed to be discreet, compliant, and grateful. But in that moment, compliance would have erased her. Around them, the hall seemed to pause. Courtiers pretended to focus on their tasks, but they watched with the fixed attention of those who understood that power often revealed itself in quiet, unguarded moments. No one spoke. Speech would have broken the illusion that this was a simple meeting, a passing intersection of paths. Everyone knew better. This was the first time the two women had faced each other without walls, servants, or schedules designed to keep them apart. The air did not change. Yet it felt heavier. Their gazes remained steady, neither drifting nor softening. It was remarkable how much could be said without a single word. The wife carried the certainty of her lawful place, the knowledge that tradition, however cold, stood at her side. The mistress held the fragile boldness of someone who had nothing except the attention of one man. and that attention could vanish as quickly as it came. But for a moment, they were equals. Not in rank, but in vulnerability. Both understood that what happened here would be remembered, retold, twisted, and positioned against them. Both knew that turning away first would be interpreted as defeat, and both knew that the king, wherever he stood, was watching not for affection but for advantage. The gaze ended not with a gesture, but with a shift in the hall, someone's cough, a servant's misstep, the faint rustle of linen. Yet the tension remained long after their eyes drifted apart. A single glance had carved a silent mark through the morning, one that the court would spend weeks discussing in murmurs. The wife continued forward with her steady stride. The mistress moved to the side as her role required. But something had broken, or begun, or revealed itself. No one could say for certain. What they all understood, however, was that nothing about that meeting had been accidental. The hall swallowed their separation, but not the memory. And long after both women had left, the stone floor still felt as though the moment lingered there, unable to fade completely. The quiet meeting settled into the hall like a shadow that refused to lift. Yet the air carried a faint unease, as if another shift waited beyond the morning's calm. And somewhere within the palace, a presence neither woman expected was already preparing to step into their path. The hall had been arranged long before either woman arrived, as if the architecture itself understood that avoidance could no longer continue. Light filtered through the high windows in thin, pale strips, touching the stone floor without offering warmth. People moved through the space with careful steps, each one aware, though none would say it aloud, that this morning carried a quiet intention. The palace did not rely on coincidence. It relied on design, and the design placed both women within the same vast room, where private tension could no longer remain hidden. The wife's entrance was predictable, guided by ceremony. Her role required her presence at official gatherings, and the hall served as the stage on which her legitimacy was constantly displayed. She walked with the solemn steadiness expected of her, every movement echoing the weight of tradition. Courtiers greeted her with the soft bows of practiced respect, their eyes lingering just long enough to confirm that she remained the rightful figure in this space. The hall, large as it was, seemed to shift around her path. The mistress, however, entered without ritual. Her steps were quieter, not by intention, but by circumstance. She had been sent to the hall under an instruction disguised as an invitation, fully aware that refusal was not an option. Her presence had always belonged to hidden corridors, private chambers, and passages where curtains could soften the scandal of her existence. But today the palace demanded something different. Today, she was asked to walk openly through a room that had never been meant for her. The hall absorbed the contrast between them. Its walls had witnessed arguments, treaties, betrayals, and celebrations. Yet the energy that settled now was different. Subtle but unmistakable. The distance between the wife and the mistress narrowed with each passing moment, not because they sought each other, but because the architecture left them nowhere else to go. In a palace full of choices, this was the one place where choice had been quietly removed. People filled the edges of the room, courtiers adjusting their sleeves, scribes carrying documents, servants moving with silent efficiency. Yet the centre of the hall remained strangely open, as though the space had carved itself into a path meant to guide the two women toward an inevitable encounter. Anyone observing could sense the careful orchestration of it. They had all seen how the king manipulated rooms, schedules, and movements when he wanted a particular outcome. This gathering was no different. There was no conversation between the wife and the mistress, no spoken confrontation, no request or apology. Their mere presence within the same hall already broke the unspoken rules that had kept them apart. The court understood the meaning. The church understood it. Even the servants understood it. When two women bound to the same man appeared in public, silence carried more weight than any declaration. Every step they took was watched, not openly, but from the corners of eyes, from the stillness of hands resting on embroidered sleeves, from the tension carried in the breath of those standing nearby. Court life had always been built on observation, and this moment became another quiet performance, one in which neither woman chose to participate, yet both were forced to play their part. The wife held her posture with the practiced calm of someone who had endured years beneath the expectations of lineage and duty. Her gaze drifted across the room, never hurried, never uncertain. It was not arrogance, but survival. The mistress, aware of every whisper her presence invited, walked with a caution sharpened by necessity. She did not shrink, but she also did not pretend the hall welcomed her. And still, the space pressed them forward. The walls seemed to draw nearer. The crowd subtly parted, and even the air felt more focused, as though guiding the moment to its predetermined point. The hall did not allow them the luxury of turning away. Public presence meant public acknowledgement, whether desired or not. No one spoke the truth aloud, that this meeting had been engineered, that the king wanted to see how each woman would behave, that the court wanted proof of tension they had only imagined until now. Instead, the silence of the room stretched between them, a silence that revealed more than any accusation could. The hall, indifferent yet complicit, served as the witness. In its vastness, it forced two women to occupy the same breadth of space, neither able to retreat without surrendering something far deeper than pride. Public presence was not optional. It was a requirement, a test disguised as routine. And in this place where power was measured by who could remain unshaken, the room itself became the first judge. The hall absorbed their presence like a quiet verdict waiting to be spoken. Yet, something in its stillness suggested that this forced closeness was only the beginning of a larger strain. And somewhere beyond the watching crowd, a shift neither woman expected was already taking form. Before this day, their lives had been arranged like two parallel lines, close enough to feel the tension, yet never allowed to touch. The palace had long perfected the art of separation. The wife moved within halls marked by tradition, where duty formed the boundaries of her existence. The mistress occupied quieter spaces, chosen not for comfort but for concealment. Their routines were crafted so precisely that even the sound of one woman's footsteps rarely drifted into the orbit of the other. These boundaries were not accidental. They were strategies. For months, the king had balanced them with the calculation of a man who understood the fragility of peace. Keeping the women apart protected his authority, his reputation, and the illusion of control. Every corridor they walked was selected for them. Every gathering was structured around avoiding discomfort. Even the servants had been trained to adjust schedules, redirect paths, and offer subtle warnings when danger of overlap arose. Silence had been the king's shield, and distance its strongest defense. But silence can exhaust itself, and distance can grow thin. The whispers in court had begun to swell, filling empty rooms and lingering in stairwells. Questions grew harder to ignore. How long would he hide them from each other? What power did each woman hold behind closed doors? Which of them mattered more? These were not inquiries made aloud, but in Tudor courts. Unspoken questions were often the most dangerous. They had a way of pressing themselves into political chambers, shaping decisions in the shadows. The king felt this pressure. Whether he acted by intention or by surrender to the murmurs around him was unclear even to those closest to him. Some believed he orchestrated the encounter with the precision of a man seeking clarity. Others believed he was cornered, forced to reveal the truth he had tried to hide. And still others whispered that he simply wished to watch, to measure the reactions of two women who represented conflicting versions of his life. Whatever his motive, The result was the same. The lines that had kept them apart finally converged. The hall that morning had not been chosen randomly. Its size allowed the illusion of freedom while leaving no real escape. Its openness created visibility, not privacy, and its central role in court life made the meeting appear unplanned, as though fate rather than strategy had drawn them together. It was the kind of stage perfect for observing human behavior while pretending to ignore it. The court, too, bore its own responsibility. Curiosity had grown like a slow fire at first, then steadily consumed. They wanted to see what happened when legitimacy met desire, when duty faced ambition, when tradition collided with a quieter, more dangerous form of influence. A single interaction could confirm suspicions or create new ones. And suspicion, in Tudor England, was as valuable as gold. Servants felt it as well. They had carried messages, arranged chambers, tended to garments, and overheard enough fragments to know that the meeting was inevitable. They were not surprised when the separation finally broke. In many ways, they had expected it long before the king allowed it to occur. For the wife, this was a breach in the order she had been taught to protect. For the mistress, it was an unwanted climb into the open world, where judgments were made in silence. Neither woman had asked for this moment. Yet both were pulled into it, as though the palace itself had grown tired of keeping them apart. This was the first time, only because every moment before had been carefully prevented. The significance did not lie in the meeting itself, but in the crumbling of the distance that had once defined their roles. Once that barrier broke, nothing that followed could be separated as neatly as before. The court did not speak of it directly, but there was a collective understanding. The moment two women bound to the same man were forced into public space together, the illusion of control fractured, and once fractured, it could not be restored. The quiet collapse of their separation lingered in the hall, long after the king's intentions faded into rumour. Yet the air around them suggested that this moment had opened something no one was prepared to name. Somewhere within the court, a presence already watched for what this fragile shift might awaken. The palace operated on rules no one wrote down, yet everyone obeyed. These rules drifted through the corridors like drafts of cold air, shaping behaviour more effectively than laws ever could. In this world, silence held more authority than proclamations, and appearances determined survival. Every woman who entered the Tudor court learned quickly that power was rarely expressed through words. It lived instead in posture, in distance, in carefully measured restraint. Nowhere was this more true than in the quiet rivalry between a wife and a mistress. The wife's conduct was dictated by centuries of expectation. She was the embodiment of order, lineage, and continuity. And for that reason, she was denied the luxury of honest emotion. Public anger was not permitted. Raised voices were forbidden. Even sorrow had to be softened into a controlled expression. Though she carried the heaviest burdens, she carried them silently. Because disruption, even justified disruption, risked unraveling the image of stability she was required to uphold. A single misstep could brand her as unstable, unfit, or unworthy, no matter the truth behind her restraint. For the mistress, the restrictions were different, but just as severe. She was allowed to exist only on the condition that she did not forget her place. She could never stand too close, speak too boldly, or walk with a confidence mistaken for equality. Her power lived in the shadows, acknowledged but never admitted, seen but never legitimized. The same king who relied on her affection would be the first to reprimand her for displaying anything resembling pride in public. Her influence had to remain invisible, because invisible influence was easier for the court to tolerate. The space between the two women became a boundary neither was permitted to cross. The wife could not confront her openly, no matter how deep the betrayal felt. The mistress could not approach her directly, no matter how much the king's attention emboldened her. Their entire relationship unfolded within a set of constraints that demanded composure at all times. What could not be spoken took form in the smallest gestures. Slow movements, tightened hands, steady breath. And in this rigid environment, the most powerful tool left to them was the gaze. Eyes carried what voices were forbidden to say. A single glance could convey defiance, resignation, warning, or wounded pride. The court learned to read these glances as though they were declarations. Servants paused mid-stride when two women's gazes crossed. Courtiers shifted uneasily, aware that witnessing such a moment placed them closer to danger than they wished. Nothing in these exchanges was loud, yet everything was unmistakably sharp. To look directly at another woman in such a setting was to expose the truth everyone pretended not to see. The wife's gaze held the slow weight of tradition. It reminded the room of structure, of hierarchy, of the long, unbroken line of women before her who had endured the same quiet humiliations. Her eyes did not rise abruptly. They lifted with measured control, as though even acknowledging the situation required careful handling. She could not afford to appear threatened. Threat implied vulnerability, and vulnerability was a weakness the court expected her to outgrow. The mistress's gaze, however, carried tension rather than certainty. She had no legal standing to protect her, no ancestral name to shield her, no official title to justify her presence. Her strength depended on an unpredictable man whose loyalty could shift with the tide of his moods. And yet she could not lower her eyes, for lowered eyes conceded defeat. She needed to show she existed, not as an equal, but as a force that could not simply be ignored. Every look she allowed herself to hold was a risk, measured against the possibility of becoming irrelevant. These unwritten rules functioned as a quiet choreography. Conversations paused when the two women entered the same room. Servants positioned themselves at safe distances. Courtiers pretended to be occupied, though their attention remained fixed on the silent exchange unfolding before them. Even the king, who orchestrated much of the tension, often avoided intervening. He preferred to observe how each woman navigated the restrictions imposed upon her. Their reactions revealed far more about them than spoken words ever could. Nothing in the court was accidental. Meetings were arranged, but glances were permitted to grow naturally. People believed that watching the wife and the mistress interact, without speaking, without touching, without breaking decorum, revealed more about the future of the palace than any official decree. In their stillness, the court read warnings, predictions, alliance, and the quiet shifting of power. These unspoken rules governed every moment of their shared existence. Neither woman dared violate them, not because of fear alone, but because the court punished impropriety with something more destructive than scorn: isolation. Once a woman lost the confidence of the palace, she lost everything. It was safer to speak through glances than to take the risk of letting words betray intentions. In this world, the gaze became the final language available to them. Precise, sharp, and impossible to misinterpret. The weight of these silent rules pressed heavily against both women, shaping every breath they allowed themselves to take. Yet the fragile order created by such restraint trembled the moment they were forced into the same room. Someone within the palace was already calculating how this tension might shift loyalties in unexpected ways. A stillness settled over the hall the moment their eyes met. A stillness so sharp it seemed to pull the breath from the room. It was not dramatic, nor loud, nor filled with sudden movements. Instead, it carried the quiet severity of something long anticipated, finally materializing. To anyone passing through, it might have looked like two women simply acknowledging each other. But for those who understood the silent architecture of Tudor life, this was no simple acknowledgement. It was a confrontation delivered without a single spoken word. The wife allowed her gaze to rise with deliberate control. Nothing about her expression wavered. She did not narrow her eyes or tighten her jaw. Such displays were beneath the discipline she had cultivated over years of fulfilling a role defined more by endurance than affection. No matter the turmoil beneath her composure, she presented a still surface that revealed nothing. Her gaze held the steady weight of someone who had learned that revealing emotion meant surrendering advantage. Across from her, the mistress responded with a gaze she could not avoid. Hesitation would have been interpreted as fear. Looking away would have been read as submission. Every rule of her precarious existence demanded that she prove she could withstand the scrutiny of the court. Even if her heart beat faster beneath her embroidered bodice, she met the wife's eyes not out of confidence, but out of necessity, a refusal to be erased by silence, or to be diminished by the judgment of those who believed she did not belong in the hall at all. An unspoken conversation stretched between them. Neither woman blinked. Neither shifted. Neither attempted to soften the moment. Their gazes spoke in ways their mouths could not. In that silent exchange lived defiance, warning, and recognition. Two lives bound to the same man, yet separated by the long, cold shadow of hierarchy. Their rivalry was not built on emotion alone. It was constructed from the fragile scaffolding of power. And here in this room, power was measured not in words, but in the ability to endure being watched. Around them, the hall absorbed the tension like stone absorbing the chill of winter. Courtiers stilled their hands, stiffened their posture, and tried to pretend their attention had not already been captured. Servants slowed their steps to avoid crossing the thin line between curiosity and disrespect. Even the faint murmur of distant voices fell away, leaving an uneasy quiet that wrapped itself around the two women. A single glance in the Tudor court carried more danger than a raised voice. Words could be twisted, reconsidered, denied. A look, however, could not be rewritten once witnessed. Those who observed this moment knew precisely what it meant. They watched for blink, breath, tilt of head, anything that suggested retreat or assertion. They studied the way the wife's shoulders remained level, the way the mistress stood, rooted despite the tremor that surely ran beneath her calm exterior. Silence had never felt more alive. Each woman understood that she was being evaluated not only by the other, but by the entire court that pretended not to be watching. Their gazes became instruments of survival, tools shaped by years of unspoken threats, whispered alliances, and carefully curated restraint. In a world where women could lose everything with a single misstep, the ability to maintain a steady gaze became its own form of armor. Even the king's presence, whether just beyond a column or merely imagined, added another layer of strain. He was a man who read power through stillness. His interest lay not in affection, but in how each woman managed the roles he had imposed upon them. Would the wife cling to dignity? Would the mistress rise to challenge her unspoken boundaries? He would measure their composure, compare their reactions, and make decisions based on which expression revealed the stronger hold. The mistress understood this acutely. Her gaze carried tension sharpened by fear and pride, held in place by the knowledge that if she faltered here, her position could collapse into dust. Yet the wife, with all her controlled poise, understood something just as crucial. Appearing threatened would fracture the authority she desperately needed to preserve. So each woman steadied herself in ways that could not be taught, ways learned only through pain, expectation, and the cruel scrutiny of the court. The moment stretched long enough for unease to deepen, but not long enough to break either woman. Eventually, the tension loosened, not through resolution, but because the moment had already carved itself into memory. Their eyes drifted apart, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement that the hall had witnessed the first open challenge between them. Movement resumed around them, though everything felt altered. Servants breathed more freely. Courtiers exchanged uncertain glances. Even the air carried the impression of something delicate having cracked. A gaze had replaced a spoken declaration, and its quiet force lingered like a shadow that would not lift. Nothing had been said, yet everything had changed. A thin residue of that silent clash lingered in the hall long after both women stepped away. Yet beneath the resuming bustle, the tremor in their unspoken challenge refused to fade. Another presence within the palace had already begun to consider how this invisible conflict might shift the balance of what came after. Calm settled over her face the way frost settles over a field. Quiet, steady, and untouched by whatever storms churn beneath the surface. Her eyes lifted with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had lived long enough inside the palace to know that emotion, no matter how justified, held no value here. Nothing in her gaze betrayed fear or anger or wounded pride. She had learned, over countless mornings and endless ceremonies, that the court watched her as one might watch a vessel filled to the brim, waiting for even a tremor to reveal weakness. She had refused to tremble for years, and she refused now. Her gaze moved slowly across the hall, not searching, not challenging, simply acknowledging the space that belonged to her by right. There was no sharpness, no flare of jealousy, no panicked attempt to reclaim the room. Her eyes carried the weight of legitimacy, the quiet authority of someone who did not need to prove anything aloud. Every line of her posture reinforced the same message her gaze delivered. She existed within a structure older and stronger than the whims of desire. Nothing about her gaze attempted to dominate. It did not need to. Power, when rooted in tradition, often expressed itself through stillness rather than force. The court understood this. They read it in the measured way she blinked, in the slow turn of her head, in the way her eyes rested momentarily on each figure, without urgency. She was present without performing presence. She was dignified without reaching for dignity. In a world where women could be pushed aside with startling ease, she remained anchored because the palace itself recognized her role before she ever spoke it aloud. Her eyes finally reached the mistress. Yet, even then, her expression did not sharpen. Instead, her gaze held a quiet endurance, the kind built from years of holding together a life she had never been allowed to shape. She did not rise to challenge the intrusion into her marriage, nor did she shrink from it. The mistress belonged to the shadows of the king's decisions, but the wife belonged to the unbroken line of women who had stood in this place before her. Her gaze reflected that lineage, steady, slow, unbroken. Something was unsettling in the way she refrained from acknowledging the mistress as a threat, not because she failed to understand the danger, but because she understood it all too well. A threat acknowledged becomes a wound. A threat ignored becomes a strategy. Her eyes conveyed neither approval nor disdain. Instead, they carried a deeper truth, a quiet declaration of existence, a message spoken not through sound, but through the calm refusal to disappear. Her gaze seemed to say, "Without movement, I am still here." That silent statement traveled through the hall more effectively than any whispered rumor. It reminded the court that the crown had rules even the king could not bend without consequence. It reminded them that the wife was not merely a symbol, but a foundation. In the shifting world of Tudor alliances, foundations mattered. Even those eager to witness conflict sensed the gravity of her restraint. She did not need fire. She held the cold, enduring strength of stone. Years of expectation had carved her into someone the court recognized before she entered a room. The weight of duty pressed against her every day. Yet her eyes remained disciplined, measured, untouched by the chaos her life invited. She had learned to let the palace read nothing on her face except the certainty of her position. That certainty was what made her gaze so unsettling. It did not fight. It endured. And endurance, in a world trained to crush quiet women, could be more dangerous than open defiance. Her gaze did not linger long on the mistress. That alone carried meaning. A long stare might have revealed fear or accusation. A glance might have suggested avoidance. But her measured, controlled look communicated something else entirely. the understanding that she did not need to defend herself against someone whose life depended on a man's unpredictable affection. She had seen mistresses arrive before. She had seen them fade. Her gaze reflected memory as much as presence. Around her, the court observed with the kind of caution reserved for moments that might shift the balance of power. They watched the calm way she breathed, the still way she held her head, the quiet authority that settled around her like a mantle. Even the mistress, for all her boldness, seemed to sense the chilling steadiness in that gaze. The heavy reminder that legitimacy does not shout, it simply stands and refuses to move. Her eyes conveyed resilience, not triumph. They spoke of the countless moments she had been expected to remain composed, the sacrifices she had buried behind the calm exterior, the loneliness she never voiced. All of it lay beneath the surface, hidden yet shaping her resolve. Nothing about her gaze reflected victory. It reflected survival. And in that silent, unyielding look, the court recognized the truth. She would not be pushed aside easily. A quiet strength radiated from her gaze long after she lowered it, settling over the hall like a restrained warning. Yet beneath that composed exterior, a shift in her resolve hinted at a deeper tension forming in the shadows around her. Someone within the court would soon attempt to test the limits of the calm she carried so carefully. Her gaze rose with a sharpness that did not belong to confidence, but to necessity, pulled upward by the quiet terror of what lowering her eyes would mean. She did not possess the steadiness of the wife, nor the protective armor of legitimacy. Every glance she offered the court had to be calculated, shaped, restrained, and still somehow brave enough to survive the scrutiny that awaited her. Her eyes met the wife's with a force born from survival, not from certainty. Tension threaded through her expression like a thin wire pulled too tight. She stood in a world that had never been designed to hold her safely. Her position depended on a man whose desires shifted with seasons, whose affections warmed and cooled with alarming speed. She understood that she walked along a collapsing edge, and her gaze reflected that understanding. It was direct, almost painfully so, because a softer look would have signaled surrender. She could not afford surrender. Not here. Not now. Her eyes carried a tremor hidden beneath the stillness. Not a visible shake, but a heaviness. The kind that forms when someone tries to hold themselves together in a place waiting for them to fall apart. She knew that if she looked away even once, the court would write its conclusion in permanent ink. They would whisper she was afraid, or weak, or undeserving. They would twist her quiet moment of vulnerability into a narrative she could never escape. She refused to let them. A direct gaze was the only weapon left to her. Most women in her position had been taught to remain invisible, to enter quietly, to leave softly, to occupy the spaces that did not matter. But invisibility would destroy her now. She needed to show the court, the wife, and perhaps even herself, that she had enough resolve to stand upright in a room that wanted her gone. Hargazi, fragile as it was, fought against the instinct to retreat. It fought against years of being told she had no rightful place in the world she now faced. The court observed her with the fascination of people watching something delicate attempt to hold its shape under pressure. They noted the tightness around her mouth, the slight lift of her chin, the way her eyes refused to drop even when uncertainty flickered beneath them. She was not a woman accustomed to open confrontation, but circumstances left her no choice. Her gaze had to serve as both shield and claim, declaring with silence what she could never say aloud. The wife's calm expression only heightened the strain. It reminded everyone, including the mistress, of the immense difference between them, one anchored by tradition, the other floating at the mercy of favour. Yet the mistress did not allow that difference to bend her posture. She understood that recognition, even the smallest fragment of it, required resilience that bordered on defiance. Her eyes attempted to carve a place for her in a hall that resisted giving her one. What lingered in her gaze was not challenge but longing, the the desire to be acknowledged, to be seen not merely as a disruption or an embarrassment, but as someone who existed with weight and presence. She did not expect acceptance. She expected acknowledgement, the fragile kind that proves a person has not been erased. That longing thrummed behind every second she held the wife's gaze. There was no arrogance in her look, only resolve. She carried herself like someone who knew disappearance was the easier path, yet refused to take it. Every breath she drew beneath the heavy fabric of her gown was a reminder that she was fighting against the inevitability of being forgotten. The court saw this, though they would never say it aloud. They watched the battle unfold quietly in her eyes. A battle for dignity, for space, for the right to exist in a world that preferred she remain silent and unseen. For a brief moment, her gaze softened, not in surrender, but in recognition of the impossible position she occupied. She knew she stood before a woman the court would protect at all costs. She knew that her presence alone invited condemnation. And yet, she kept her eyes steady, refusing to let fear pull them downward. Her expression was not triumphant, but enduring. She carried the brittle strength of someone who has learned to hold themselves together with nothing but will. In the silence of that hall, her gaze revealed the truth she could not voice. She wanted to be seen, not celebrated, not elevated, simply acknowledged. Her eyes spoke the words her life had rarely allowed her to say, "I exist, even if you wish I did not." No one dared respond to that silent plea, but everyone heard it. A thin urgency lingered in her gaze long after she finally looked away, leaving the hall marked by her quiet insistence. Yet beneath that resolve, a fragile edge suggested she understood how easily her place could vanish in an instant. Another shift within the court was already forming, drawn toward the tension she could no longer hide. A strange suspension settled over the hall, as though the air itself had tightened around the two women and refused to let the moment pass. Their gazes, already charged with more meaning than anyone dared to admit, locked into place with an unbroken intensity that made time feel distorted. Seconds stretched into something heavier, thicker, almost unwilling to move. The atmosphere shifted so subtly that only those accustomed to reading silence could sense it. Yet the shift pulled the entire room into a single, breathless stillness. No one spoke. No one shifted. The hall, usually alive with murmured conversations and cautious footsteps, grew unnervingly quiet. Even the faint clatter of distant servants faded, as if the palace understood that this was not a moment to interrupt. People stood with hands half raised, half lowered, mid-motion, mid-thought. Every gesture paused in anticipation of something none of them could name. They had not expected the women to hold each other's gaze for this long, nor with such steady, unyielding force. The wife's eyes remained calm, grounded by the authority of her role. She did not blink quickly or look away in discomfort. Instead, her gaze rested on the mistress with a measured stillness, the kind built from years of learning to carry the expectations of an entire lineage. Her expression did not waver. She understood that turning away first would allow the court to read a narrative she did not wish to grant them. In this space, composure was her final line of defense. Across from her, the mistress held her gaze with a tension that bordered on fragile determination. She stood, rooted to the spot, shoulders tight, breath carefully controlled. Her eyes, though strained, refused to lower. She knew that even a moment of retreat would confirm the assumptions of a court eager to see her fold. It would sentence her to invisibility in a place where invisibility often meant eventual removal. She could not permit that, so she held still, clinging to the thin edge of courage she had managed to gather. The silent clash between them grew more pronounced as the seconds accumulated. Courtiers exchanged hesitant glances, careful not to be seen staring too openly. They recognized the significance. This was not a fleeting moment of discomfort, but an unspoken contest neither woman could walk away from without consequence. The court did not intervene. Intervention would have implied taking a side. And in Tudor politics, taking a side before the king did was a dangerous misstep. Even servants who usually moved with quiet efficiency halted their steps, aware that any disruption, no matter how small, might be interpreted as disrespectful or presumptuous. The hall seemed to expand and contract at once, drawing both women into the center of the court's attention despite the oppressive silence that pressed against the walls. What made the moment unsettling was not the tension itself, but the endurance of it. Neither woman flinched. Neither softened. Neither attempted to disguise the truth reflected in their eyes, that they were bound together by circumstances neither controlled, forced into a collision neither wanted, and watched by a court that enjoyed dissecting their humanity. Their gazes spoke not of affection or rivalry, but of survival. The longer they remained locked in stillness, the more the room felt transformed. Time seemed to lose its ordinary rhythm, stretching thin as a thread pulled too far. A few courtiers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the strain, yet unwilling to disrupt the moment. Even the torches lining the walls burned more quietly, their flames rising and falling in slow, almost cautious intervals. It was not aggression that held them in place. It was the mutual understanding that the court would shape their futures based on what happened here. A downward glance, a step back, a tremble. Any sign of yielding would become a story, repeated in whispers, reshaped into rumor, and eventually weaponized. Public perception was as dangerous as any decree the king might issue. So they continued to look at each other, neither blinking too quickly nor looking away too soon. The gaze became its own fragile structure, brittle yet sustaining, pushing both women into a suspension neither had anticipated. The court waited for a break that did not come. When the moment finally loosened, it did so, not because either woman surrendered, but because the hall itself seemed to exhale. A slight movement from someone at the edge of the room, a faint shifting of gowns, a soft rustle of parchment. Tiny details punctured the stillness, allowing time to resume its natural flow. Yet the memory of that prolonged gaze lingered as a residue across the hall. It clung to the stone floor, travelled along the tapestries, and embedded itself in the imaginations of everyone present. No confrontation had occurred. No words had been traded. Yet the court felt as though it had witnessed something irreversible. Neither woman walked away victorious. Neither walked away defeated. But the moment left a mark. Subtle, cold, and impossible to forget. A trace of that suspended silence lingered long after the hall regained its usual movement. Yet beneath the resumed routine, the fragile tension from their locked gaze continued to echo in quiet corners. A quiet curiosity within the court had already begun to curl toward whatever this moment might disturb next. Silence crept into the hall with an ease that startled even those accustomed to courtly restraint. It emerged the moment their eyes held, spreading outward like a slow-moving tide that erased every sound in its path. What should have been a brief pause became something heavier, something that settled across the gathering with the weight of an unspoken warning. People sensed that this stillness was not accidental. It carried intention, consequence, and the fragile outline of a shift no one dared to articulate. The tension seemed to shape the air itself. Movements softened into half gestures, hands hovering over goblets, feet slowing mid-step. No one wanted to draw attention to themselves during a moment that felt as though the court had stepped into a story whose ending remained unwritten. The usual rustle of silk and murmur of polite exchanges faded until the hall resembled a portrait. Frozen, watchful, and aware of its own vulnerability. Their gaze remained unbroken. Each second it lasted pressed against the room like a cold hand, testing the composure of those who witnessed it. Courtiers lowered their eyes only enough to protect themselves from accusations of staring. Otherwise, they absorbed every detail with the attentiveness of people who knew their futures might depend on how they interpreted what they saw. In Tudor politics, perception was a form of currency, and today it was being spent in silence. The wife's steadiness unsettled the crowd. Her gaze held no trace of haste or fear. It rested with a quiet authority shaped by lineage and expectation. She did not need to display dominance. The hall already understood where she stood in the hierarchy. Her composure was not a performance, but an inheritance. The mistress's resolve unsettled the room differently. Her eyes carried a tension sharpened by necessity. She could not afford hesitation, nor could she allow her expression to betray the unease running beneath her calm exterior. Each breath she took felt measured, each blink deliberate. She held her place, not because it felt natural, but because retreat would have confirmed every whisper predicting her eventual collapse. Though no words were exchanged, the court read the silence as if it were text. They watched the women with the same focus usually reserved for royal decrees. The king's intentions, the balance of alliances, the shifting loyalties of noble families. All of it could be altered by how these two women met each other's eyes. It was astonishing that a single moment could contain so much possibility. Yet, no one doubted that it did. Rumours did not begin with speech. They began with conclusions forming quietly in the minds of those watching. Some believed the wife's calm expression revealed the certainty of someone who had nothing to prove. Others believed the mistress's refusal to look away revealed a strength the court had underestimated. Still others suspected that the meaning lay somewhere between the two. That this was not a contest won or lost, but a new beginning for a conflict long anticipated. The silence thickened further as the tension continued unbroken. Servants who normally moved without thought halted near doorways, choosing to become invisible rather than risk interrupting the moment. Even the distant echo of footsteps along the outer corridors seemed to fade, as if the stone itself had chosen to listen. People held their breath without realizing it. Shoulders rose subtly, chests tightening with the effort to remain still. Even those who wished to retreat found themselves unable to look away. There was something magnetic in the stillness, something that drew every eye toward the center of the hall despite the fear of appearing involved. Only when a small shift, a slight turn of a head, the faint loosening of the air, passed between the two women did the hall begin to breathe again. The moment dissolved, but not cleanly. It left a residue in the air, a thin layer of unease that clung to the edges of the room like lingering smoke. Movement returned slowly. Conversations restarted in cautious fragments. Yet every glance carried the memory of the silence that had pressed upon them. People who had stood beside one another for years now avoided each other's eyes, afraid their interpretations might reveal too much. Whispers emerged later, blooming quietly in private corners. Some said the wife had looked stronger. Others said the mistress had shown an unexpected resilience. A few insisted that what they had witnessed was merely a prelude, not a conclusion. No rumour fully matched the truth, yet each one carried a fragment of it. By the time evening settled over the palace, the moment had already become a living story, repeated, reshaped, and carried through halls where even the walls seemed to listen. A single glance had unsettled the court more deeply than an argument ever could, and nothing within the palace felt entirely stable afterward. A faint echo of that suspended silence clung to the hall long after order attempted to return. Yet beneath the surface of routine, tension gathered in places no one wished to acknowledge aloud. Curiosity within the court began drifting toward whatever shift this moment might quietly provoke. He stood slightly removed from the center of the hall, positioned just far enough that his face remained unreadable, while his presence remained unavoidable. The king had long mastered the art of appearing disengaged, a habit sharpened not by indifference but by strategy. It allowed him to observe without exposing intent, to gather information without granting anyone the satisfaction of knowing they were being studied. On this day, he relied on that skill more carefully than usual. His gaze drifted over the hall with the calm rhythm of someone accustomed to command. Yet those closest to him sensed the subtle sharpness beneath it. though he did not look directly at the two women. Every shift of their posture, every flicker of their expression, registered within him. He seemed to weigh them silently, as though the tension between them had become a form of currency he could spend at a later moment. Pretending not to notice was a calculated decision. To react openly would force him to take a side, and he was not ready to declare an allegiance in a conflict that had only just shown its first visible signs. The court had not missed this. They understood that the king's stillness was never empty. It was an instrument, and today it served to keep the balance of power deliberately unsettled. His composure made the moment more unsettling. He appeared to study an arrangement of flowers near the dais, or the placement of torches along the wall. But those familiar with him, counselors, guardsmen, and long-time servants, recognized the tension in the set of his shoulders. His mind was not on the hall's decoration. It was fixed on the unspoken contest unfolding before him. Whether he approved or disapproved, no one could tell. The king valued silence in moments like this. He believed that when people were left without guidance, their true nature emerged. If he spoke, the wives would become cautious, the mistress defensive, the courtiers stiff. But in silence, everyone revealed something: loyalty, fear, ambition, resentment, all without meaning to. So he let the hall sink deeper into its stillness, watching how each person responded to the fragile moment hanging between the two women. He knew the wife's strength. He had seen it in her endurance, in her steady composure during council disagreements, in the quiet dignity she carried, even when overlooked. He did not need to study her long to know what she would do. Her behavior was consistent, predictable, and anchored in years of training and expectation. The mistress, however, required more attention. She was newer to the court, newer to its traps and its shadowed corners. Fragility, tense yet unbroken, revealed something the king had not anticipated. Not defiance. He would have recognized defiance immediately. What he saw instead was resolve. A thin, trembling resolve. Perhaps, but resolve nonetheless. She did not shrink from the wife's calm authority, nor from the weight of dozens of eyes pressing against her from all sides. This interested him. The court often misunderstood what drew the king's attention. It was not beauty, nor obedience, nor even affection. It was potential. Specifically, potential that could be shaped, redirected, or used to disturb the balance in his favor. Watching the mistress hold her ground without collapsing told him she possessed a resilience that might become useful or dangerous. The line between the two was thin. He let the moment linger. Intervention would have diminished the power he could draw from the tension. To interrupt would be to claim responsibility for whatever unfolded next. He preferred the opposite, to let the court decide its narrative while he quietly kept control of its consequences. The more the court whispered, the more he learned. When the women finally broke their gaze, he did not shift his posture. He remained still, as though nothing significant had occurred. His refusal to react forced the court to react in his place. Already, he could sense the beginnings of interpretation. Subtle glances, tensed shoulders, and murmured breaths that carried more meaning than spoken words. People were deciding who looked stronger, who looked threatened, and what it might mean for their own positions. He let them decide. Their conclusions, even the incorrect ones, would reveal alliances and fears more clearly than any decree he could issue. His quiet observation continued, even as the room regained movement. A nod here, a faint tilt of the head there. Small signals that masked the extent of what he had absorbed. The king rarely moved first. Power, in his view, belonged to the one who waited, not the one who acted. Waiting forced others to show their intentions. Waiting preserved the advantage. In the aftermath of the moment, he stood perfectly still. It was a stillness that made the court uneasy, and that was precisely why he maintained it. His silence after witnessing the moment settled over the hall like a thin sheet of frost, offering no clear direction. Yet behind that quiet composure, a slow calculation had begun, shaping how he would use what the court had exposed in its stillness. Some faint disturbance waited at the edge of the king's restraint, ready to surface when he decided the silence had served its purpose. Attention in the hall shifted in quiet, deliberate waves, moving from one cluster of onlookers to the next as people tried to understand what they had just witnessed. The tension between the two women had already carved itself into the atmosphere, but the reactions of the surrounding court began shaping a second, equally delicate layer of meaning. Each glance, each tilt of the head, each subtle pause revealed more about the room than anyone dared speak aloud. The nobles watched with the precision of individuals accustomed to reading danger in silence. Their expressions remained controlled, yet their eyes moved with a restless sharpness. They studied the wife's posture, the mistress's tension, and the king's restrained stillness, piecing the moment together like a puzzle whose outcome could alter their positions. A single shift in power could redraw alliances, and everyone sensed that something small but significant had begun to shift. No one allowed their gaze to linger too obviously. Instead, they cast quick, angled glances, just long enough to gather information, never long enough to be accused of staring. Every noble in the room understood that the wrong expression, offered at the wrong time, could become ammunition for rivals. They weighed their reactions carefully, not because they feared the women themselves, but because they feared the implications of supporting the wrong one. The ladies-in-waiting carried a different kind of watchfulness. They whispered among themselves with the caution of people who were always near the center of the storm, yet rarely permitted to acknowledge it. Their eyes flickered from the wife to the mistress, then toward the king, searching for the smallest sign of preference or disapproval. They traded observations in soft, restrained breaths, brief interpretations that could never be spoken beyond their tight circles. Servants along the edges of the hall held their gaze even more cautiously. They had learned long ago that their eyes could betray them faster than their words. Still, curiosity tugged at them. Their glances were brief but revealing, a flash toward the wife's face, a quick dart toward the mistress's tense jaw, a lingering moment on the stillness of the nobles. They observed everything, even the details the nobles failed to notice. The courtiers closest to the scene shifted their weight slightly, a small adjustment that carried layers of meaning. They were deciding, in silence, which direction the wind was blowing. In the Tudor court, choosing a side too early could be fatal, but choosing one too late could be even worse. People tried to read each other's expressions with the desperation of individuals searching for invisible signs. Some believed the wife's composure indicated victory. Others saw the mistress's unbroken gaze as a sign of unexpected endurance. But the truth was simpler. No one knew. The uncertainty forced people into quiet calculation, pushed them to measure their loyalties against the risks that lay ahead. Even those with no personal stake in the unfolding tension felt its weight, sensing that the hall had entered a precarious balance. The whispering that passed between attendants and courtiers did not form words at first. It lingered as breath, as the faintest tremor of movement, as a shift in the eyes. People communicated in glances the way others communicated in speech. A raised eyebrow suggested suspicion. A narrowed gaze hinted at disbelief. A subtle tightening of the mouth expressed concern. These silent exchanges traveled quickly, stitching themselves across the room. Every person in the hall seemed to adopt their own interpretation of what the moment meant, guarding it as carefully as a secret. Some looked toward the future and imagined how this tension would shape the months ahead. Others looked toward the present and recalculated their immediate behavior. A few looked toward the past, recalling stories of mistresses who rose too high or wives who lost too much. What none of them could do was remain neutral. Silence may have filled the hall, but it was not passive. It was the silence of people choosing sides before they dared to speak them aloud. It was the silence of ambitions adjusting themselves. It was the silence of individuals waiting to see which woman the king's gaze would favour when he finally stopped pretending not to notice. Even the walls seemed to hold the tension. The tapestries, heavy with old stories, absorbed the unease in their folds. The torches flickered with a cautious stillness, their flames barely moving in the air that felt too tightly held. By the time the moment passed, the court had already begun to divide itself. Not visibly, not openly, but in the quiet arrangement of loyalties that formed beneath composed faces. People were not merely watching, they were aligning. The hall had not erupted with reaction. It had constricted around one, and the consequences of that narrowing had only just begun. A faint layer of calculation lingered among the nobles, each of them quietly reassessing the landscape reshaped by a single, unbroken moment. Yet beneath their controlled expressions, shifting loyalties pressed against the silence, like ripples beneath still water. Whispers would soon acquire direction, carried by those eager to secure advantage before the next shift arrived. Silence settled across the hall with a weight that felt almost deliberate, as if every person present had reached the same unspoken conclusion at the same moment. Words, even the smallest ones, felt dangerous. No one wished to disturb the fragile balance that had formed between the wife and the mistress. And no one wished to be the first to speak into a moment that clearly belonged to them alone. The air became tight, held in place by the collective instinct to remain quiet. People in the Tudor court understood better than most that a single misplaced comment could be fatal. Speech lingered, travelled, transformed, and returned in altered forms. It could be repeated, distorted, or weaponized. Once released, a word belonged to the room, not to the speaker. And in a hall where loyalties shifted with alarming speed, the wrong sentence could stain a reputation more quickly than scandal. So the court kept its silence, guarding itself with a restraint born from experience. The nobles, though accustomed to speaking freely among themselves, held their tongues. They knew that acknowledging the tension aloud would suggest alignment with one woman or the other. Even a polite observation, too warm toward the mistress, too sympathetic toward the wife, could be interpreted as an intentional statement. So they remained still, eyes carefully lowered or fixed neutrally on the floor, pretending to focus on the details of tapestries or the arrangement of torches. A spoken word would have exposed them. A gaze could be denied. Ladies in waiting, who usually whispered with the quick ease of people who lived close to power, exchanged no more than fragmented breaths. Their glances communicated enough worry, curiosity, and calculation, but they did not allow language to shape those reactions. Speech created evidence. Eyes did not. They shifted slightly behind their respective mistresses, holding their bodies in tight, controlled postures meant to convey loyalty without intrusion. Servants, who rarely had the luxury of speaking at all, stood even more rigidly. Their silence did not come from fear of taking sides, but from fear of being noticed. They knew that sound, especially from their direction, could disrupt the moment and draw unwanted attention. They held their trays, their jugs, their cloths, waiting for movement or instruction that did not come. The weight of the moment made them smaller, quieter, almost invisible. The silence itself became a type of protection. It shielded the court from accusations. It shielded the king from any pressure to react. It shielded the wife from pity and the mistress from mockery. The hall understood, collectively and intuitively, that words would fracture what had not yet broken. Silence was the only safe option. Even the king, who could have ended the tension with a single sentence, remained still. His silence set the tone. If he did not speak, No one else dared to. Those closest to him understood that he chose to withhold his voice not out of indifference, but because silence offered him more information. Speaking too soon would have closed the moment. Remaining silent allowed it to reveal itself. Rumors would come later. They always did. But in this moment, while eyes remained fixed and breath remained shallow, the court understood that silence left nothing behind. A gaze could be reinterpreted. A posture could be debated. But a spoken word hardened into something permanent. Too many lives had been damaged by words that echoed farther than intended. So the hall held its quiet. The tension between the two women pulsed through the silence, forming the shape of an unspoken exchange more powerful than any dialogue. Their gazes had become the language of the moment, carrying layers of meaning no words could safely express. And because the women spoke only with their eyes, the court felt obligated to reflect that restraint. Each person, from noble to servant, recognized that they were witnessing something delicate and charged. They were careful not to intrude upon it. Even the smallest cough or misplaced step felt inappropriate, as though sound itself might fracture the line the women were balancing upon. In this hall, where ambitions clung to shadows and alliances formed beneath layered glances, silence became its own form of allegiance. It kept intentions concealed. It preserved deniability. It allowed each person to interpret the moment privately, without exposing themselves publicly. Only after the gaze finally broke and movement returned to the room did people dare to consider speaking. Even then, voices emerged cautiously, soft and fragmented, as though they feared resurrecting the tension by naming it. The silence had kept them safe, and they did not abandon it quickly. The hall had witnessed a fragile moment of power, and silence had been its only shield. Trade. A residue of caution lingered long after the quiet eased, holding the court in a hesitance they could not fully shake. Yet beneath that restraint, people were already shaping private interpretations that would later drift into rumor. Whispers would soon find their way into corridors, once the safety of silence had served its purpose. No one announced the rule aloud. Yet the entire hall understood it with a clarity that required no teaching. In the Tudor court, where power lived in subtleties and survival depended on perception, lowering one's gaze meant yielding something far more valuable than pride. It meant surrendering presence. It meant allowing the court to decide your position for you. And once the court decided, the conclusion was nearly impossible to undo. Both women knew this before their eyes ever met. It was woven into the lessons handed to the wife since childhood, and carved into the silent fears the mistress had learned to navigate. Their lives had been shaped by different paths, but both paths taught the same truth. A bowed head could erase a woman long before history ever recorded her name. When their gazes locked, neither intended to challenge the other openly. The moment emerged from circumstance, not choice. Yet once it began, each woman understood what hung in the balance. Position, not emotion, guided their reactions. The wife, whose legitimacy had been secured by lineage and ceremony, could not be seen shrinking from the presence of someone the court considered temporary. And the mistress, dependent on the fragility of favour, could not allow herself to appear intimidated. A single downward glance from her would signal the beginning of her disappearance. The hall felt this understanding ripple through it like a cold draught slipping beneath a closed door. People did not speak, but their stillness revealed their comprehension. They watched carefully, calculating what it would mean if the wife looked away first, or if the mistress did. Each possibility opened a different path, and each path carried its own dangers. The wife's gaze remained steady, built from a lifetime of discipline. She had learned long ago that composure was not merely a virtue, it was a weapon. A queen or noblewoman who failed to hold her expression risked losing control of her narrative. So, she stood, rooted. Her chin lifted slightly, her breath measured, her eyes unwavering. Her stillness communicated what her words never needed to. I remain the one who belongs here. Across from her, the mistress carried a tension sharpened by the knowledge that she was always one step from erasure. Yet she remained standing, eyes fixed, refusing the instinct to lower them. Her resolve did not carry the wife's natural authority, but it carried something just as compelling, fear disguised as willpower. And in the Tudor court, where appearances mattered more than truth, willpower could momentarily resemble strength. Their stillness drew the room tighter around them. No one intervened. No one dared interrupt. The hall had become an arena where two women stood locked in a conflict they did not initiate, yet could not escape. Beneath the polished surfaces and measured breaths, the truth pressed hard against them. The first to look away would lose more than dignity. Nobles leaned ever so slightly forward, careful to conceal their anticipation. Servants froze with trays balanced in trembling hands. Ladies in waiting studied the scene with anxious precision, as though memorizing each second might help them predict the outcome. Even the king, still and unreadable, allowed the moment to stretch without interference. Waiting allowed truths to surface. Waiting revealed who understood the weight of silence. The women held their gazes with the determination of people fighting battles no one else could see. Seconds accumulated like stones, added slowly to a scale. At any moment, one of them could break, but neither did. The possibility of defeat tightened every muscle in their bodies. Yet their faces remained composed, each refusing to give the court what it expected, a sign of weakness. Time extended itself around them, bending into a thin, fragile tension that made even the torches seem hesitant to flicker. Nothing moved except the air between them, charged with the cold understanding that vulnerability could not be shown. Not here. Not now. People watching the moment felt it settle into their memories with the weight of something that would be repeated later. Whispered in corners, reshaped in retellings. They saw not only the tension but the fear behind it. The fear of becoming invisible. When the moment finally loosened, no one in the hall knew who had won. Neither woman looked away in retreat. Neither allowed her gaze to fall. The stillness simply fractured under the pressure of its own endurance. But the court would still try to assign meaning. They always did. The rule, though unspoken, had been honored. No one had bowed. No one had vanished. But the danger of doing so lingered like a shadow behind them, waiting for the next moment of hesitation. A thin residue of tension clung to the hall after their unbroken stare dissolved, leaving people unsure which way the balance had shifted. Yet, beneath the outward calm, the fear of yielding remained etched into every witness's memory. Eyes across the court had already begun to search for the next moment, when hesitation might expose a weakness neither woman could afford. The contrast between the two women became clearer when the hall finally allowed itself to breathe again. Their clothing, chosen long before this moment, selected for reasons unrelated to confrontation, suddenly carried new meaning. In the Tudor court, garments were never just garments. They were statements, shields, boundaries, and warnings stitched into fabric. Today, those meanings pressed against the air with a weight neither woman could ignore. The wife stood in the heavy colours reserved for her rank, shades that did not shine so much as settle into the dimness with authority. Deep burgundy, dark blue, muted gold, tones rooted in ceremony rather than personal preference. Her gown, lined with stiff materials and structured embroidery, held her posture as firmly as her own will did. Nothing about the fabric invited softness. Nothing suggested fragility. Even the weight of the sleeves communicated endurance, as if she carried not cloth, but centuries of expectation draped across her shoulders. The structured bodice shaped her stance into something immovable. Her back straightened, not because she meant to intimidate, but because the clothing allowed nothing else. It lifted her chin slightly, framed her face, and turned her silhouette into a quiet assertion of place. The hall recognized the message immediately. Her attire aligned her with tradition, legitimacy, and continuity. She wore the kind of weight that only belonged to someone the court was taught to respect. The mistress, in contrast, wore colours that captured the eye even when she wished they would not. Lighter fabrics, brighter shades, details chosen to flatter rather than anchor. Her gown held movement rather than stillness, its lines softer and less rigid. Falling along her frame with a grace the court could easily reinterpret as vulnerability or allure, depending on their mood. She did not choose these colours to provoke tension today. Yet, in this moment, the brightness isolated her. She appeared distinct, not because she wanted to stand out, but because the court demanded she remain separate. Her gown lacked the weight of lineage, yet it carried its own burden. Visibility. Every thread reminded her that attention, once gained, could quickly turn hostile. The fabric allowed her to move more freely than her wife. But that freedom had never translated into safety. Instead, it left her exposed, standing in the open with nothing to anchor her to the space except the fragile hold of the king's favour. The way they stood revealed even more than their clothing. The wife's stance was rooted in stillness, her feet planted at a controlled angle, shoulders square, spine unbroken by movement. She occupied space the way someone does when she knows that space has already been reserved for her. She did not need to assert dominance. Her posture simply reflected what the court already believed: that she belonged here, that she represented stability, that she was the fixed point around which the room quietly arranged itself. The mistress stood differently, caught between the instinct to appear composed and the instinct to remain unobtrusive. Her posture held a tension the wife's did not. Her shoulders remained slightly lifted, her breath measured, her hands held carefully at her sides, as though afraid of drawing the wrong kind of attention. She looked outward with control, yet her body revealed the effort required to maintain that control. She did not claim space. She held it only because stepping back would signal defeat. The distance between them became a canvas for unspoken hierarchy. Their postures shaped the air, sculpting invisible boundaries. Nobles watching them understood these boundaries instinctively. They read posture the way soldiers read terrain. A weight shift could indicate uncertainty. A lifted chin could suggest defiance. A tightened jaw could hint at fear. And in the Tudor court, these silent cues mattered more than spoken declarations. Even the fabrics responded differently to the moment. The wife's gown barely moved, absorbing tension without shifting. The mistress's fabric, lighter and more delicate, trembled faintly with every breath she took. That difference did not escape the room. People noticed the stillness of one and the vulnerability of the other. They catalogued it silently, adding it to the growing interpretations they would soon share behind half-closed doors. Their clothing had been chosen to present them, but in this moment, it exposed them. The wife appeared grounded in a structure she did not need to justify. The mistress appeared suspended in an uncertainty she could not escape. Both postures, both wardrobes, told a truth neither woman dared to speak aloud. Power did not always belong to the one who stood the tallest. Sometimes it belonged to the one whose stillness held the room. And today, the room belonged to neither of them fully. It held itself in a fragile balance, shaped by fabric, posture, and the silent knowledge that the court was always watching. A quiet awareness lingered in the hall, shaped by the stark contrast in how each woman occupied her space. Yet beneath the composed surfaces, the court sensed how clothing and posture had exposed vulnerabilities neither woman intended to reveal. Attention had already begun to shift toward the length of the moment itself, waiting for signs of what its endurance might mean. Time did not behave normally in the moment their eyes met. It stretched in a way that made the seconds feel thick, as if they carried more weight than the room could comfortably bear. What passed between the wife and the mistress lasted only a brief flicker in ordinary measure. But within the hall, it expanded until it felt almost suspended. People sensed it immediately. The strange pull of a moment, refusing to end. Refusing to collapse into the background the way most courtly exchanges did. Those few seconds embedded themselves into the consciousness of the room with a precision that made them unforgettable. Even before the moment had fully dissolved, the court understood it would be repeated later in quiet retellings. The nature of Tudor life made such moments valuable. They offered material to interpret, to exaggerate, to shape into meaning. And because this one held no words, it invited endless speculation. The wife's steady gaze and the mistress's unbroken resolve became the raw fragments from which stories would soon be built. People replayed the seconds in their minds, even as they occurred, storing them for later examination. They would revisit the angle of the wife's chin, the tightness in the mistress's posture, the silence that formed around them like a boundary no one dared cross. Each detail, however small, would travel through the court with surprising endurance. By the end of the day, versions of the moment had already begun to form. They remained quiet at first, speaking only in the privacy of guarded corridors or in the hushed tones of attendants moving between chambers. But even in these early whispers, the story stretched and shifted. Some described the wife's expression as serene, others insisted it carried a flicker of judgment. Some claimed the mistress stood with the confidence of someone newly empowered. Others said her hands trembled. No version was entirely accurate. Each retelling shaped the memory according to the fears or hopes of the speaker. As days passed, the moment detached itself from the reality of the hall. It entered the realm of stories. Small, passing statements that drifted across tables during meals or between ladies as they adjusted gowns before gatherings. The silence that had originally protected the women now fed the court's imagination. Because nothing had been said, everything could be interpreted. Months later, the memory persisted. The moment resurfaced whenever new tension arose between factions in the palace, whenever the king shifted in temperament, whenever a new rumour touched the wife or the mistress. People looked back at the gaze as if it were an early sign, a subtle warning, a quiet prophecy of what would eventually unfold. They searched their recollections for symbols they believed they had missed. Years later, the moment survived, even in the recollections of those who had not witnessed it themselves. It became one of those small yet enduring court stories, retold, reframed, and polished by repetition. Servants passed it down to new attendants. Courtiers inserted it into conversations about shifting tides of favour. Some spoke of it with a tone of respect, emphasising the wife's unwavering composure. Others described it with curiosity, marvelling at the mistress's courage. Still others used it to illustrate the unpredictable nature of power. Versions multiplied. In one, the wife's gaze was icy and unforgiving. In another, the mistress met it with a defiance that shocked the room. In yet another, the king had watched with a faint smile, pleased by the tension. None of these stories could be confirmed. None could be denied. The truth had long since been swallowed by retellings. What persisted most strongly was not the accuracy of the moment, but the memory of how it felt. People recalled the tightening of the air, the stillness that wrapped the hall, the strange awareness that something fragile had been exposed. They remembered the collective breath-holding, the fear of speaking into a silence that seemed to belong to a higher power. These sensations remained more vivid than the expressions themselves. The gaze lasted only seconds, but the stories grew beyond those seconds, carried far past the walls of the hall. Living in the recollections of people who had witnessed countless small shifts in the palace, yet could not forget this one. The moment endured because it was simple. Two women. One glance. No words. And because simplicity rarely survived in a court trained to build meaning where silence held space. The glance did not fade. It multiplied. A faint shadow of those seconds lingered in every retelling. gathering new layers long after the moment had dissolved. Yet beneath each version, the court clung to the original tension, as though it still echoed through the hall. Stories would continue to shift, drawn toward whatever new imbalance the court believed the moment had quietly begun. The moment their eyes parted did not release the hall from its tension. Instead, it left behind a quiet residue that settled across the court like fine dust. Too light to see, too persistent to ignore, people resumed their movements with careful restraint, aware that something subtle had shifted. The hall looked the same, yet its atmosphere carried a new, unmistakable outline. Change in the Tudor court rarely announced itself loudly. It began in silence, then spread through interpretation. Those who moved closest to the center of power sensed the alteration first. The nobles adjusted their behavior in ways so slight they appeared accidental. Their bows deepened by a fraction when approaching the wife. Their glances toward the mistress lingered a moment longer, measuring her with renewed curiosity or concern. Their conversations became more delicate, their smiles more cautious, as though the hall had reminded them that even the smallest interaction could carry unexpected consequences. The court had not chosen a side. It had simply recognized that there were now sides to choose. The mistress felt the weight of the shift almost immediately. Attention, once intermittent and easy to dodge, tightened around her like a narrowing boundary. People watched her with the sharpness reserved for those who had stepped into a space previously unoccupied. Some looked at her with muted intrigue, reassessing old assumptions. Others examined her with skepticism, searching for cracks in the composure she had forced herself to maintain. The change was not hostile. Not yet. It was evaluative. Everywhere she walked, eyes followed, not openly, never rudely, but consistently enough that she felt herself being catalogued. Every gesture she made acquired unintended meaning. If she lowered her gaze, some viewed it as submission. If she held it steady, others labeled it as ambition. Her silence became part of her image, revised and interpreted in hallways she did not enter. Attention had become a double-edged blade. She could not welcome it. She could not escape it. The wife, too, felt the shift. Though she revealed nothing, her demeanor remained unchanged. Steady, controlled, quietly dignified. But the court's reaction toward her subtly altered. People approached her with more caution, as if her stillness had gained a sharper edge. Servants stepped with greater precision in her presence. Ladies stood nearer to her than before, drawn by the reassurance of her composure. Conversations hushed at her approach, not out of fear, but out of respect tinged with uncertainty. Her distance, once seen as reserved politeness, now looked like strength. She had not faltered during the moment that held the hall. And in the Tudor court, stability, even the quiet kind, was valued more than affection. Yet that same distance also isolated her. People admired her resilience, but they did not move closer. Instead, they relied on her as a fixed point while keeping themselves carefully beyond the reach of her private emotions. She had become a symbol of endurance rather than a figure of companionship. That transformation held its own kind of loneliness. The king observed the shift with a detached curiosity. He made no adjustments. Not outwardly, but he noted the changing atmosphere with interest. The hall had responded to the gaze even more strongly than he expected. That response would offer him leverage later. For now, he allowed the change to unfold naturally, watching as loyalty recalibrated itself through whispers and glances. As hours passed, the alterations became more defined. A noble woman who once ignored the mistress now offered her a small, measured greeting. A courtier who regularly praised the wife hesitated before speaking to her. A group of attendants exchanged looks when the two women passed, their expressions carving new narratives in real time. These changes were slight enough to go unnoticed, yet meaningful enough to build the foundation for future alliances. The mistress became more visible. The wife became more untouchable. The court settled into a new balance. Unstable, watchful, waiting. In private rooms, behind carved doors and heavy curtains. The moment was already being reframed. Some described the wife's composure as a quiet victory. Others insisted the mistress had gained ground by refusing to yield. A few claimed nothing significant had happened at all, though their voices trembled with uncertainty. No matter the version, every retelling confirmed the same truth. The hall felt different now. The gaze had shifted more than their eyes. It had shifted the terrain beneath them. A thin awareness of altered loyalties lingered in the palace long after movement returned to the hall. Yet beneath the measured calm, the court sensed a slow reordering of attention, drawn toward whoever might gain or lose ground in the days ahead. Unspoken tension began to collect around the space between the two women, waiting for whatever the next encounter might reveal. Nothing about the moment between the two women belonged to the realm of emotion, despite what outsiders later preferred to imagine. It was not jealousy, nor a private quarrel, nor the predictable clash of women bound to the same man. What unfolded in the hall existed on a different level entirely, one shaped by territory, survival, and the quiet knowledge that a single misstep could unravel a life built over years. Their gazes carried the weight of this understanding, turning what appeared simple into something far more complex. Each woman stood at the edge of a boundary she had spent years maintaining. The wife's territory was not merely physical space, but an inheritance of expectations, duties, and the legitimacy granted by lineage. She protected it not through aggression, but through unwavering composure. Her silence, her posture, her steadiness, all served as the borders she drew around herself to remain unshaken. She knew the court measured her not by affection, but by endurance. The mistress's territory was far more fragile, carved from shifting ground and held together by appropriate conduct. She did not possess the security of a title, nor the permanence of marriage. What she had instead was presence, a presence that could expand or collapse depending on how she carried herself. Every step she took inside the palace tested the edges of this uncertain territory. Today, her gaze served as its reinforcement, a quiet signal that she refused to be erased. Neither wished for confrontation, yet survival demanded it. The court, with its polished surfaces and layered glances, understood this instinctively. People did not see two women vying for affection. They saw two figures navigating the raw mechanics of power. It was the kind of struggle the Tudor court recognized immediately. A conflict waged not with words or open displays, but with careful restraint. The wife defended what tradition had given her. The mistress defended the small, unstable space she had earned through circumstance. No one truly prevailed in that moment. Victory required clarity. The gaze offered none. The wife remained composed, but the court sensed the effort it required. The mistress appeared resolved, yet her tension revealed how precariously she held her ground. Their eyes did not reveal triumph. They revealed mutual awareness, an acknowledgement that both stood in a place where stepping back could mean slipping out of relevance altogether. Survival in the Tudor court was rarely loud. It unfolded quietly, through gestures and silences, through the steady maintenance of presence. The two women engaged in this kind of survival long before the hall fell silent, and they would continue long after the echoes faded. What happened today was only the beginning, a subtle shift in how each would navigate the dangerous terrain of favor and perception. Courtiers recognized this beginning with a mix of fascination and caution. Some watched the wife, noting how her calmness had hardened into something sharper. Others observed the mistress, intrigued by her refusal to yield. A few looked toward the king, searching for signs of preference, though he revealed nothing. The court did not declare sides that afternoon, but each person privately considered what the moment meant for their own positions. Both women sensed these shifting currents. The wife understood that her role, though stable, was no longer untouched. She would need to preserve her ground with more vigilance. The mistress understood that she had stepped into a realm where visibility brought both opportunity and danger. She would need to tread with precision, careful not to give the court excuses to tighten its scrutiny. The moment between them marked the start of a longer, quieter contest. There would be no proclamation, no announcement of rivalry, no overt hostility. Instead, small details, posture, tone, the distance they kept, the glances they exchanged, would accumulate over time, shaping the invisible territory each claimed. People who later retold the story often reduced it to a matter of jealousy. They spoke of unspoken accusations, simmering resentment, or the predictable conflicts of women connected to the same man. But jealousy was far too small to describe what took place. Jealousy required emotion. Survival demanded clarity. In the Tudor court, clarity was the sharper force. The gaze between them had not resolved anything. It had only revealed how much was at stake, and the hall, heavy with silence, understood that a long struggle, quiet, intricate, and far more dangerous than it appeared, had begun its first slow movement. A thin recognition settled through the court, shaped by the knowledge that neither woman had stepped back from the space she guarded. Yet, beneath the surface of composure, both now carried the awareness that their futures depended on how they navigated the moments still to come. Tension waited along the edges of the hall, ready to surface again when the next small shift forced them to defend their ground once more. The gaze that passed between the wife and the mistress did not remain contained within the fragile space they occupied. It travelled outward, slipping quietly into layers of meaning that reached far beyond personal tension. In the Tudor court, even the smallest gesture could be repurposed into political language, and the court received their shared silence as if it were a message crafted with intention. The women did not speak, but their eyes carried words that landed with unmistakable clarity. The first message reached the king. He stood slightly apart, watching without seeming to watch, gathering information from their stillness in a way only a ruler accustomed to subtle warfare could. The wife's gaze, steady and anchored, reminded him of the structure she embodied: marriage, lineage, and the preservation of the realm's appearance. It spoke of continuity, of duties upheld, of a presence that did not waver even when provoked. The mistress's gaze, tense but unwavering, offered something different. It revealed a resilience he had not fully measured, a willingness to stand exposed before a room waiting for her to falter. Her resolve communicated that she would not disappear quietly, that her existence within the court was no fleeting ornament. For a king who relied on shifting pieces to maintain balance, this resilience was either an asset or a threat. He had not yet decided which. Both gazes carried messages, and both reached him clearly. The second message belonged to the court. Noble, attendant, and servants all interpreted the silence according to their own fears and ambitions. The wife's composure served as a reminder of her position. Solid, ceremonial, and deeply rooted in tradition, she embodied what the court expected: predictability, propriety, and quiet strength. Her gaze told them she understood her place and would not relinquish it. The mistress's gaze, by contrast, unsettled them. It suggested movement within a system that preferred stillness. She did not shrink beneath the weight of so many watching eyes. Her refusal to look away challenged the unspoken hierarchy, forcing the court to reconsider assumptions about her fragility. In a place where perception shaped reality, this kind of challenge carried dangerous potential. Whichever direction the court leaned, they understood the message: The balance between these women was no longer passive. The third message reached a quieter audience. Their future selves. Both women understood, even as they stood frozen in the hall, that moments like this were not easily forgotten. The wife knew she would be measured against her composure for years to come. She had represented not only herself, but her role, her lineage, and the expectations built into the crown she wore. Her gaze preserved her dignity, but it also locked her into a path that demanded continued steadiness. Any future wavering would be compared to today. The mistress knew the moment would follow her as well. She had stepped into visibility she had not sought, but could no longer avoid. Her gaze had carved a place for her within the court. Small, precarious, but undeniable. Yet that place came with risk. In the future, every action she took would be interpreted through the memory of this moment. Her resolve would be expected. Any sign of retreat might erase the strength she had shown. Their eyes had spoken promises neither woman could easily break. The hall, still heavy with the residue of tension, absorbed these messages with unsettling ease. Every political signal in the Tudor court travelled without sound, shifting under the surface like a tide tugging at the foundations of the palace. People carried what they had witnessed into their private thoughts, reshaping it into strategies, warnings, and stories that would influence decisions long after the moment itself faded. In this court, power rarely moved through declarations. It moved through pauses, glances, and the careful positioning of bodies within a room. A bowed head could signal surrender. A lifted chin could suggest ambition. A sustained gaze could announce the start of a new conflict without a single word being spoken. The wife and the mistress had not intended to craft political statements, but intent mattered far less than perception. The court had already read meaning into their silence. The messages had been sent, received, and silently filed away in the minds of people who would use them as reference points in future storms. When the tension finally thinned and movement returned, no one spoke of the messages aloud. They remained suspended in the hall, stored in glances exchanged between nobles. In the king's quiet thoughtfulness, in the changed way attendants carried themselves around the two women, the moment had become part of the political air. Intangible, yet unavoidable. Their eyes had not merely met. They had spoken, and the court had heard every word. A faint thread of meaning continued to coil through the hall, shaped by the silent signals neither woman intended to send. Yet beneath the returning calm, the court carried those messages like hidden documents, ready to interpret them in whatever ways best served their shifting loyalties. New tensions began forming quietly, drawn toward the implications of a glance that refused to remain personal. Hours had not passed before the first whisper stirred. It drifted through corridors lined with tapestries, slid beneath heavy wooden doors, and settled into rooms that had not witnessed the moment themselves, yet somehow felt its impact. The Tudor court lived on fragments, half-seen gestures, poorly interpreted silences, and glances stretched into stories. What had begun as a single shared stare between two women now fractured into countless retellings, each shaped less by truth than by the storyteller's desire for meaning. People debated who had looked longer. Some swore the wife held her gaze with the steadiness of someone shaped by duty. Others insisted the mistress refused to break first. Her chin lifted with a quiet defiance no one expected from her. As the tale travelled, each version contradicted the last. No two recountings matched. Yet every listener treated what they heard as fact. Then the second question emerged. Who turned away first? This question held weight because in the Tudor court, turning away was never just a gesture. It was a verdict. Some claimed the mistress had broken the moment, bowing her head like someone acknowledging the limits of her place. Others said the wife had stepped aside first, giving the impression of retreat, even if done out of royal protocol. Neither version had proof, but proof was unnecessary. What mattered was repetition. the more a rumour was spoken, the sharper its edges became. By dusk, the whispers shifted toward the next day's invitations. The court studied guest lists, with an attention usually reserved for war councils. Who was placed closer to the king? Who was moved farther down the table? Who was left off completely? Every adjustment was interpreted as fallout from the silent confrontation. Servants carrying trays overheard nobles, murmuring that proximity at dinner would reveal whom the king favoured after witnessing that stare. If the mistress's name appeared high on the list, it meant her defiance had impressed him. If the wife held the prominent position, it meant her composure had reassured him. The truth, as usual, mattered far less than the speculation. Even the religious schedule did not escape interpretation. People noted who walked beside whom during the chapel procession. The wife's deliberate pace, the mistress's careful posture. Both became fodder for those who measured power by the length of a shadow or the angle of a lowered head. Then came the subtler observations. Who stepped forward in a room? Who was asked a question aloud? Who received an extra beat of the king's attention? These details were insignificant on their own. Yet the court knew how to stitch together scraps until a narrative formed. They whispered these fragments as though they were clues in a puzzle no one had officially been asked to solve. What emerged from the talk was not a single story, but a shifting landscape where every version influenced the next. Some narratives painted the wife as the quiet victor, her poise unmistakable. Others elevated the mistress, portraying her as a rising force, refusing to be diminished. A few tales even suggested the king himself was unsettled, re-evaluating the balance within his household. The rumours grew bolder as night deepened. Servants repeated overheard conversations in kitchens where the heat of the ovens did nothing to warm the chill of gossip. Guards muttered brief interpretations while standing beneath torchlight, their shadows flickering across stone walls. Ladies-in-waiting exchanged theories behind embroidered fans, each leaning closer, voices dropping to whispers, shaped more by excitement than caution. No one mentioned the truth, that the moment itself had lasted mere seconds, too brief to support the weight of so much speculation. Instead, the court built a fiction that felt more real than what had occurred. In a place where reputation determined survival, rumour functioned as both weapon and currency. The wife and the mistress, unaware of each other's retelling, had become characters in a story shaped by dozens of unseen hands. Even those who had not witnessed the moment spoke of it with confidence, layering assumptions atop guesses until the court trembled under the pressure of its own imagination. That is how power worked here. Quietly, without evidence, without confrontation, moving through whispers until it hardened into belief. By the time the castle lamps dimmed, the rumour had already completed a full circuit. It no longer mattered who had looked longest, who had turned away first, or who would sit closest to the king at the next feast. The truth had been swallowed by narrative, replaced by something more volatile. Now the question hovered in the air, quiet but persistent. If a single stare could reshape the court's perception, what would happen when the women crossed paths again? Voices thinned as night settled, yet the rumours continued drifting like fine dust, clinging to every corner of the court. Interpretations multiplied, reshaping loyalties long before the women themselves realised what their silence had sparked. Another moment awaited them, one that the court was already preparing to dissect. They crossed paths again, not by accident, but by the natural pull of court life. A place too small for distance and too crowded for escape. These meetings no longer carried the uncertainty of a first encounter. Whatever innocence might have existed before had been burned away, replaced by a new tension that settled over each shared space like an unwelcome fog. People sensed it before either woman even lifted her eyes. The air shifted. Conversations softened, and the court braced itself as though anticipating the slow approach of a storm. The wife always entered a room with the same measured grace. Nothing about her posture changed. Nothing in her steps betrayed annoyance or fear. Yet something in her presence felt colder now, as if she had quietly acknowledged that the world around her was beginning to test her foundations. She did not look away when she saw the mistress. She simply allowed her gaze to settle, steady and unreadable, like someone reclaiming a territory she had never intended to lose. The mistress, in contrast, carried tension beneath her stillness. She no longer allowed hesitation to soften her expression. Every movement she made seemed deliberate. Chin lifted slightly higher, shoulders squared with more resolve. Breath drawn a little deeper before her eyes finally rose to meet the wife's. She was no longer the intruder, uncertain of her place. Something had shifted inside her. As if the first encounter had carved a mark she now felt compelled to defend. Their eyes met again, not with the shock of recognition as before, but with a kind of grim familiarity. It was the look of two people who understood that their futures were now intertwined in a way neither had chosen. Each gaze carried memory. Each silence carried meaning. And each meeting felt slightly sharper than the one before, as though invisible boundaries were tightening around them both. People began watching these encounters more closely. The court had developed a taste for the tension, an appetite for its quiet spectacle. Whenever the two women entered the same space, whispers faded mid-sentence. The hum of conversation pulled back. Even the musicians in the great hall seemed to slow their playing without realizing they were doing it. Servants paused. Nobles leaned subtly forward, and everyone waited for the moment their gazes would cross. Those moments became rituals. At the chapel, they approached from opposite aisles, their steps echoing against stone floors that amplified every detail. The wife kept her eyes straight ahead until the final second, turning her head just enough to acknowledge the mistress's presence. The mistress returned the gesture. Never too early, never too late, mirroring a rhythm that felt both intentional and unavoidable. At feasts, they passed each other with only inches to spare. The wife's gown brushed the floor in steady arcs, trailing authority in its wake. The mistress's dress was lighter, more vivid, a deliberate contrast meant to assert her growing importance. Their shoulders nearly touched, yet neither woman shifted an inch. The tension between them was so taut that even the candles seemed to flicker under its weight. By the third or fourth encounter, something deeper emerged. Their gazes no longer simply assessed each other, they measured territory. The wife looked at the mistress as though confirming she still occupied the space expected of her. The mistress looked at the wife as if testing the limits of what she could now claim. Neither woman smiled, neither frowned, but the air between them felt colder, as if the temperature dropped each time their eyes aligned. People whispered that the tension had begun to change shape. At first, it was curiosity. Then it became a comparison. Soon, it turned into expectation. What would happen next? Who would falter? Who would rise? The court waited, hungry for signs. The king, meanwhile, behaved as though nothing had altered. Yet observers noted subtle changes. His pauses lingered longer when the two women were in the same room. His glances darted between them with quiet calculation. He seemed to recognize that something unspoken was unfolding, something that might influence the delicate balance of his household. And so, each meeting, no longer a first, no longer new, became heavier. Each look hardened slightly more than the last. Each silence carried a sharper edge. The women themselves felt it too, not through words, but in the way their breaths tightened, in the way their steps slowed when approaching one another, in the way their eyes no longer wavered. By now, they both understood that momentum had begun, and once momentum takes hold in a royal court, it rarely shows mercy. It was no longer a question of whether they would meet again. It was a question of what each encounter was slowly shaping them into. What lingered after their later encounters felt heavier than anything spoken, as if each meeting carved a deeper line between them. The court began sensing a shift that could no longer be dismissed as a coincidence. A quiet pressure settling into every shared room. Some faint memory was already forming in the shadows, waiting to decide what it intended to keep from those moments. Memory settled into the palace long after the hall emptied, moving quietly through its corridors as if it had found a permanent place to rest. It did not fade with the passing days. Instead, it sharpened, carving out the details of that first shared gaze with a precision neither woman could escape. The palace carried the moment as though it had witnessed something irreversible, something it was not prepared to forget. For the wife, the memory returned without invitation. It arrived in the early hours when the palace was still, in the muted rustle of fabric, in the distant echo of servants crossing stone floors. Her mind moved through the moments slowly, piece by piece, as if examining a fracture she had learned to live with but not ignore. She remembered the weight of her formal colours, the cold steadiness she forced into her breath, and the unmistakable awareness that the mistress's presence now stood openly before her. Yet what remained clearest was the steadiness she held, the refusal to shift her gaze, the calm that did not crack even under the scrutiny of an entire court. The mistress carried the memory differently. Hers was sharper, edged with the tension she had tried to hide beneath her posture. She remembered how her breath tightened, how the hall seemed to narrow around her, how she held her gaze because anything less would have marked her as defeated. She revisited every second of the moment, not to admire her strength, but to measure the cost of revealing herself in front of so many watching eyes. The memory pressed against her like a quiet reminder of a boundary she could not retreat from once crossed. Others remembered it too, though their recollections shifted depending on where they stood in the palace hierarchy. Courtiers spoke of the moment with the confidence of witnesses who believed they understood more than they did. Some claimed the wife held the stronger gaze, anchored by her legitimacy. Others insisted the mistress displayed a force that unsettled the hall. The details twisted as the story travelled, shaped less by truth and more by the speaker's loyalties, fears, and ambitions. No two versions matched. Yet every retelling suggested that something meaningful had occurred. Servants remembered the moment with a different clarity altogether. They observed the hall in a way the nobles never did, watching for changes that might alter their routines or jeopardize their positions. They recalled how the room shifted into stillness, how conversations thinned into silence, how even the king seemed briefly suspended in place. Their memories were shaped by caution, sharpened by the knowledge that the smallest detail could become important later. Through their whispers, the moment spread into the deeper layers of the palace, carried by those who had no voice in politics but felt its consequences first. What gave the memory its strength was the absence of visible conflict. There were no raised voices, no gestures, no movement. The stillness itself became the event. That lack of action carved its way into the palace's collective memory more deeply than any confrontation could have. Silence allowed every observer to imagine their own meaning. And over time, the imagined meanings became stronger than what had occurred. People remembered what they believed they saw, not what actually unfolded. As days passed, the memory began shaping behavior in ways small but persistent. The wife walked with a steadier posture, as though reminding the palace of the foundation she represented. Her composure became quieter, colder, and deliberate in every gathering. The mistress, meanwhile, found herself carrying the moment behind her ribs like a concealed pressure, something that both strengthened and burdened her. She stood straighter, moved more carefully, watched more intently, as though preparing for consequences she could not yet see. The court adjusted around them. People entered rooms more cautiously. Conversations paused when either woman approached. Even the placement of chairs, the order of greetings, and the direction of glances shifted in subtle ways. The memory had created an invisible line, and no one wished to be caught stepping across it. Rumours grew around the memory until the moment became larger than itself. Stories circulated in corners of the palace, each version adding a new detail, a new interpretation, a new tension. The moment became a symbol of something the court felt but could not articulate. It became a reference point in whispered conversations, a measure by which people judged the shifting balance between tradition and intrusion. Yet history would retain only fragments of the event. It would not preserve the sound of breath held in a crowded hall, nor the tightening in the king's expression, nor the weight of expectation that settled over the court. It would not record the internal shifts experienced by the two women whose lives were altered in the span of seconds. What history would hold on to was the feeling, cold, suspended, unmistakably significant, a sensation that something had changed. Even if no one could point to the change itself, the memory did not fade. It simply settled deeper into the palace, shaping the women, the court, and the quiet spaces between them. It lingered like a presence that understood its own importance, refusing to dissolve even when newer events tried to overtake it. Some moments do not disappear. They wait. Memory settled over them like a quiet verdict, shaping every movement that followed with a weight no one dared name. The court sensed a slow shift pressing beneath the surface, as though the moment had carved a path neither woman could avoid. Some quiet understanding had already begun to gather, waiting to reveal what it intended to claim from them. Power in the Tudor court rarely announced itself with movement. More often, it revealed its presence through an absence of action, as though stillness itself carried the weight of authority. That brief moment in the hall, when neither woman shifted nor lowered her gaze, became a quiet demonstration of that truth. It was not the kind of display the court expected, yet its impact settled deeper than any spoken challenge could have. The moment showed that power did not always require possession of titles or favour. Sometimes it rested in the ability to remain unmoved, to stand within scrutiny without breaking, to refuse even a fraction of retreat. The wife embodied this kind of authority in a way the court recognized immediately. She did not rely on declarations or gestures. Her steadiness was a continuation of everything she represented: lineage, tradition, the permanence of her place within the structure of the court. Simply by not turning away, she affirmed her hold on a world that had tried many times to shake her. The mistress's stillness meant something different. It was not inheritance, nor acceptance, nor the quiet assurance of legitimacy. Her refusal to move carried the sharpness of a boundary crossed deliberately, a recognition that she could no longer rely on invisibility to protect her. Her stillness was a claim made with caution, built from the fragile edge of survival rather than confidence. Yet to the court, it still counted as an assertion, one that unsettled the familiar rhythm of hierarchy. Observers understood that the moment held more than personal tension. They had witnessed a silent negotiation of presence, one that did not require words or gestures. In a court where every movement was choreographed, the refusal to move became its own statement. The weight of that stillness signaled that both women were prepared to hold their ground, even in front of those who would judge them with unforgiving precision. Power often lived in appearances, and appearances shaped the memory of the moment. The wife's posture suggested continuity, a reminder that her position did not depend on emotion. She did not flare with anger or stiffen with offense. Her stillness conveyed something colder: endurance. The mistress, meanwhile, carried a tension that expressed possibility. She represented something the court could not yet categorize, a presence that lacked legitimacy but held influence nonetheless. Together, their stillness created a contrast that the court could not ignore. The king's silence surrounding the moment amplified its meaning. He did not step forward to resolve the tension, nor did he offer reassurance to either woman. Instead, his quiet observation suggested that the moment held a value he wished to measure before acting. His restraint turned the stillness into a kind of unspoken test, one that revealed how each woman chose to navigate the sharp line between exposure and control. His lack of intervention gave the moment a sharper edge, as though he were allowing the court to decide which presence carried more weight. The moment became a symbol within the palace because it reduced power to its simplest form. No wealth, no jewels, no titles were displayed. Nothing moved. Nothing changed externally. Yet something inside the court shifted. People felt it in the air, in the way footsteps slowed when either woman entered a room, in the way conversations paused at the sound of approaching fabric. The moment lived not in actions, but in the tension created by inaction. Stillness revealed what words might have concealed. The wife showed that her authority did not require outward assertion. The mistress showed that her presence was no longer something that could be dismissed. The court saw both truths at once, and that duality turned the moment into a quiet anchor for everything that followed. History often reduces such events to summaries, ignoring the subtle forces that shaped them. It remembers battles, proclamations, and alliances, but it rarely acknowledges the power held in a single breath of silence. Yet the silence shared by these two women contained the essence of the court, its fragility, its rivalry, its dependence on perception. Stillness captured the tension more precisely than any confrontation could have. In time, the moment became more than an encounter. It turned into a symbol of how power survived in a world defined by scrutiny. It showed that influence could come from the ability to remain steady when others expected collapse. It demonstrated that staying in place, without looking away, could be an act of defiance strong enough to alter the course of relationships within the palace. The moment continued to echo because silence carried a meaning neither woman intended. Yet both came to understand. Power did not always move. Sometimes it simply watched. Stillness held the weight of what neither woman allowed to surface, settling into the court with a quiet certainty that refused to fade. A muted shift moved beneath daily routine, hinting that the moment continued shaping what others could not yet name. A faint pressure lingered behind the silence, waiting for the right breath to reveal what it intended to disturb. History rarely keeps the details that people once believed were important. It forgets the sound of voices, the shape of sentences, the tone of warnings delivered behind guarded doors. It loses the quiet exchanges in cold corridors, the muted disagreements in private chambers, and the measured breaths held between uncertain decisions. What remains instead are moments stripped down to feeling, not language. No explanation, only presence, only stillness, only the weight of what someone refused to hide. The moment between the wife and the mistress belonged to this category of memory. No letter described it. No official document recorded it. No chronicler wrote down the order of glances or the exact distance that separated them. Yet the hall where it occurred carried the echo long after the palace changed hands, long after the names of those involved faded from influence, long after the court itself shifted into new generations. The moment persisted because it bypassed language entirely and settled into sensation. Those who were present understood this without realizing it. They felt the silence before they understood its meaning. They felt the tension before they knew who it favored. They sensed that something irreversible had taken shape between two women who never spoke to each other that day. Over time, the details blurred. The memory did not. It hardened into a single truth. The moment held power because both women refused to look away. The wife, with her measured breath and steady posture, stood as though she had stepped into a role she had always been trained to inhabit. She did not need words to confirm her position. Her silence carried the years of expectation placed upon her, the structure of tradition built around her, the weight of legitimacy that settled into her shoulders long before she entered the hall. Even those who disliked her recognized that her stillness carried authority. It was not warmth. It was not pride. It was permanence. The mistress stood in a different kind of silence. Hers did not carry history behind it. It carried risk. It carried the strain of someone who understood that visibility could be both opportunity and danger. The moment she remained unmoving, the court saw her not as a rumor or a whispered suggestion, but as a presence capable of disrupting what had been stable. Her gaze did not challenge the wife directly. It simply refused to withdraw. And in a court, where retreat was often interpreted as confession, refusal became a kind of declaration. Those who watched from the edges saw the contrast clearly. They saw the wife's silence as controlled, shaped by years of expectation. They saw the mistress's silence as sharp, formed by necessity. The hall held both forms of stillness at once, creating a tension that neither woman intended to display so openly. Yet the moment unfolded without interruption, without commentary, without the protective shield of ceremony. It existed only because two people refused to break the gaze placed upon them. The court reacted in ways it did not fully understand. Some felt the moment settle deeply, knowing instinctively that it would resurface in future conversations and private judgments. Others tried to dismiss it, yet found themselves returning to the memory when they assessed alliances or speculated about shifts in influence. Over time, the moment became a reference point. People spoke of it as though it contained more than stillness, as though it revealed a future no one dared predict aloud. History, however, would not remember the speculation. It would not record the king's measured stillness or the servant's quiet observations. It would not keep the whispered interpretations exchanged in corners after the hall emptied. Those pieces dissolved, leaving only the core sensation, two women standing in silence, refusing to yield to expectation. Even the women themselves carried the memory in different ways as the years passed. The wife kept it as a reminder of the boundaries that held her life in place. She returned to the memory not for comfort, but for clarity. It represented the moment she did not falter, even as change pressed against the edges of her world. She held the memory with the same discipline she carried into every room she entered afterward. The mistress carried the memory like a weight and a warning. It lingered behind her steps, reminding her of the cost of being seen. Her world did not offer the safety of lineage or the protection of an established position. Every moment she existed in the palace required choice, control, and performance. The memory of that gaze reminded her that she had stepped onto a path that left no room for hesitation. In time, the memory outlasted the circumstances that created it. New intrigues replaced old ones. New alliances reshaped the court. New rumors pushed older tensions into the background. Yet the moment did not dissolve. It became one of those quiet events that people recalled without recalling why. Its meaning shifted with each retelling, yet the essence stayed the same. Two women facing each other in silence, each refusing to look away. When the history of the period was eventually written, the moment did not appear in any chronicle. It slipped between the lines of battles, treaties, marriages, and deaths. Yet those who inherited the stories remembered the sensation of it. Even if they could not describe it precisely, they spoke of a gaze that defined a turning point, a silence that altered a balance, a moment that marked the beginning of a quiet struggle beneath the surface of courtly life. This was the nature of power in the palace. It did not always scream. It did not always strike. Sometimes it simply watched. Sometimes it waited. Sometimes it existed in a single breath, held between two people who understood that the future might shift if either one allowed even a flicker of retreat. History kept only the feeling, not the words, not the explanation, only the weight of the gaze that refused to bend. Memory survived where language failed, leaving behind a stillness that shaped everything long after the hall emptied. A quiet impression settled over the court, suggesting that the moment between them carried more than anyone dared acknowledge openly. A lingering presence waited beyond the reach of written history, holding the echo of the gaze that both women refused to break. Good night. Rest well. May the quiet weight of distant history settle gently as you sleep.